Committee. It is now 8:30 and the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee is now called to order. First up on our agenda, we have a hearing for Senate Bill 238, reducing the certain requirements for licensure by the Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. And Jenna, would you mind giving us a bill explanation? Jenna, are you available? Okay. I do not see Jenna available, so we will.
Mr. Chair, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
My
Thanks,
video
Jenna.
there we go. There's my video. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. It was running a little bit slow, but I'm guessing that we are talking about, let me pull it up here. Senate Bill 238, which would reduce requirements for licensure by the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, which we refer to as BSRB, and it would reduce requirements for licensure, require board approval to provide clinical social work supervision, as well as expand out-of-state temporary permits to practice. And this bill, I'll note, has a House mirror, House Bill 2208, and it had a hearing earlier in the week, but it has not yet been worked. And this bill would reduce the, among other things, would reduce the number of supervised practice hours required from 4,000 to 3,000. And this would be for all of the different professions that the BSRB regulates, which includes professional counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and master's level psychologists. And you may remember, I believe it was 2018 or 2019, that those number of supervised practice hours from 4,000 down to 3,000 was done for social workers. And this would expand that for all of the other practices regulated by the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. It would also reduce the number of hours of direct supervision required down from 150 to 100. This bill would also change some of the regulations related to out-of-state practice, and it would make it a little bit easier for those professionals practicing out of state to get first a temporary out-of-state permit, as well as clarify some of the regulations in order to streamline that process to allow an out-of-state permit holder who has practiced for 2 years in their own jurisdiction, so from Nebraska or Missouri, if you've practiced 2 years in that state, that it would be easier for you to get your temporary out-of-state permit practice here. And it would also create board-approved clinical supervision for social workers, and that would allow the BSRB to clinically supervise those social workers. And there are several different client or supervision hours that are changed that you can see in the bill. It's kind of long, so I won't be going through exactly everything in the bill. And there's some fees that are amended, included for an application as a board-approved clinical supervisor. So since the board will be supervising those clinical hours, the person who does that would be required to pay that licensure fee. And there's some clarification around discipline, and it would allow a board to consider discipline in another state when determining eligibility for licensure in Kansas. So if you have had a disciplinary action in another state or DC or even, let's say, the U.S. Virgin Islands, that the board would be able to consider those and not just disciplinary action in Kansas. And it would also allow or extend the board temporary license for professional counselors from 6 months to 12 months, as well as several technical amendments, just updating some of the language and streamlining that for the entire Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board statutes that are in this bill. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Jenna, thank you for the explanation. Committee members, do we have any questions for Jenna on the bill? Senator Stephan.
Thank you, Chairman. Jenna, thank you. On multiple pages, I know page 6, line 30, and then several times on through the body of the bill, it talks about emergency circumstances as defined by the board. It seems like an odd phrase. I didn't know boards defined emergency circumstances. Can you help me understand that, please? And thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Senator, I believe that the intent of that would be to allow the board, since they already have rules and regulations authority, that they would be able to define an emergency circumstance in the rules and regulations of the BSRB. And so they would be able to define an emergency circumstance to, I don't know, to include whatever, I guess, that they felt was an emergency circumstance. If you were in a serious car accident and we weren't able to physically renew, or if there is a giant fire where you were supposed to turn everything into on that day, I'm guessing it would include just sort of those regular things like that. It would not be entirely unheard of for a board to define things like emergency circumstance that would make renewing the written application more difficult, or they might need more time.
Committee, do we have any further questions for Jenna on the bill? Seeing none, we will now move to proponents. First up, we have David Fye, the Executive Director for Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. David, welcome to the committee. Conferees, I would just ask that we do have your written testimony. We are going to try to work some bills after this hearing. So if you could, please keep your testimony to under 4 minutes. And that way we'll have enough time for questions and the ability to work the bills that we're trying to get worked today. David, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you like me to keep my mask on, or I'll take your preference?
It's a lot easier for us to understand what you're saying without your mask. So.
Okay, I'll go ahead and take it off. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Dave Fye, and I am the Executive Director of the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I am new to my position. I've been with the agency for a few months now. Our previous director, Max Foster, had been with the agency for about 8 years and recently retired. So on behalf of myself and the board, we wish him well in his retirement. I also wanted to let you know that I believe on the WebEx call, one of our board members is attending and viewing the meeting, Carolyn Zaffran. She is a board member representing social work, and she is here to answer questions if those are come up by members of the committee. You should have in my testimony, we do represent, in terms of the BSRB, we represent 7 unique licensed professions: licensed psychology, social work, master's level of psychology, professional counseling, addiction counseling, marriage and family therapy, and behavior analysis. And our mission is to protect the public and individuals who receive services from those licensees that we oversee. And we currently oversee about 13,100 licensees. The bill in front of you, Senate Bill 238, as you heard Jenna describe, is a mirror to a House Bill 2208. I just wanted to make one little correction. This bill was actually worked in the House Health and Human Services Committee last week on Thursday, February 18th, and it was passed out favorably with about 3 amendments, and so it is eligible to be worked on the House floor. So just wanted to let you know what action that committee took on the bill. In terms of the bill in front of you, Senate Bill 238, the BSRB meets and is represented by 12 individuals, 8 representing the licensed professions and 4 from the public. To assist the board, there are different advisory committees which are made up of a few different members of the board and also other individuals in those professions statewide. And so between the board and the advisory committees, they do a lot of debate and discussion about what statutes should be updated and what changes would allow for better protection of the public while allowing more individuals to be licensed and to understand the requirements of the professions. So the bill in front of you, Senate Bill 238, I wanted to speak to a few of the different items the board recommended for changes in the statute and why the board has requested those changes. The first has to do with what Jenna described, a lowering of the number of clinical supervision, the lowering of the number of supervised work experience hours from 4,000 to 3,000, and the lowering of the number of direct supervision hours from 150 to 100 for about 4 different professions. And the reason because of that is back in 2019, a bill was passed that decreased those numbers for social work. And over that time between then and now, the board has discussed if this should be applied to other professions. And the board found that this was something that they would recommend syncing up and making them consistent. Back in 2019, there was some information provided that showed that Kansas was on the high end of requiring those hours, and the board felt that they could decrease these hours and still provide better protection for the public. I also want to mention that the recommendation to decrease these hours is consistent with a recommendation made by the 2020 interim committee, the special committee that the legislative had this past interim on mental health modernization and reform. There was a workforce group, and one of the workforce recommendations, I believe the first recommendation they had, was lowering the number of these hours as related to master's level education requirements, which would fall under these clinical level positions. So this was also consistent with the recommendation of that group. I also wanted to touch upon the board's view and the discussion related to the pandemic and other changes that we have experienced in Kansas concerning the difficulty of having in-person supervision and difficulty in maintaining safety and having these supervision hours required. So the board has recommended some changes specifically to address how supervision can be conducted in a safe way. One of these is that for several of the different professions, master's level psychology, professional counseling, marriage and family therapy, and addiction counseling, there is language in the bill that would decrease it would change a person-to-person supervision to instead face-to-face. And this would allow the supervision to be over televideo. So you could do it over a screen rather than in person. And then also there is language that under extenuating circumstances, this face-to-face requirement could be waived so that individuals could use the telephone to provide certain supervision. And that would be in cases, for example, like you're in Western Kansas or another area, and the signal is not strong enough at the moment or because of a storm that you cannot do face-to-face because of the video screen. And so you can allow some telephone supervision in cases such as like that. Jenna also spoke about the changes to be recommended for the temporary out-of-state permits. And these temporary out-of-state permits, we've seen an increase in the number of individuals from out-of-state practicing in Kansas using these temporary permits under the pandemic, providing services to Kansans. And the board wanted to make some changes to increase services for Kansas, but also add some protections for the public. So they wanted to increase these from the 15 days that are currently in statute to 30 days to allow more services to Kansans. And currently in statute, the expiration date is December 31st of whatever year that they're obtained. The board thought it would be more fair to give them a window of time from the year that it was approved. So basically, instead of having an expiration date of December 31st, it would expire 1 year after it is attained. And then they could have the 15 days of in-state practice over that year. The board also wanted to require 2 years of in-state practice in their jurisdiction prior to obtaining these permits to sync it up with the Kansas clinical requirements, and then required quarterly reports so the board would know what days they're actually practicing in-state. And then also wanted to clarify that these really aren't intended to be a year-to-year temporary permit continuation. You can have one additional one, the board wanted to clarify, but that can be an extension with 30 additional days of practice, but that would be only under emergency circumstances. The board really wanted to direct people, if you're going to continue to practice in Kansas, we would request that you go through the formal licensure process. Jenna spoke about the language in the bill to require board-approved clinical supervision of social workers. That would begin January 1st of 2022, and the board would establish a one-time fee with a cap of $50, and then in regulation, the board had recommended setting that at $25. This would be a one-time fee. It's not something that would need to be renewed. I also wanted to mention, currently in statute, the professions of professional counseling and marriage and family therapist also include language to charge a fee, but this was never set in statute in terms of the amount. So this bill sets the similar $50 cap for these professions, and then in regulation, they would set it at $25. And just briefly, I wanted to highlight in the testimony, I mentioned some of the national associations that recommend board-approved supervision as a best practice. And also there was a survey of Kansans in terms of clinical supervisors or clinical practitioners. And of the people who responded, the majority of those who responded indicated that they were in favor of some training for supervision. And then briefly, there were about 4 other items in the bill that I can briefly speak to. There are a certain number of direct client contact hours which are required in the practicum for professional counselors and social workers and the other professions. The advisory committees weighed in on if these numbers should be adjusted or stayed where they are currently at. The professional counselor recommendation was to decrease the hours from 350 to 280, and that is consistent with the national accrediting body. They have 280 as the standard, and so that would drop it from 350 to 280. Additionally, for social work practicum, there was discussion about whether this should be reduced or eliminated. And the recommendation was to go ahead and reduce this to 350 to 200 hours. And to clarify, these are part of the 900 hours in your practicum, but Kansas is the only state that clarifies of these 900, 350 must be direct client contact hours. And so the board had discussions about whether to remove this requirement or not, but recommended that there is still value in having these direct client contact hours specified, and recommended that they be reduced from 350 to 200. And then, as Jenna mentioned, there's just some smaller.
Dave, I apologize, but we can keep on going, but we're gonna run out of time. So if you could, just one quick closing comment and so we can get to other conferees.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I just wanted to touch on these points for the committee, but I appreciate you hearing this bill. I think it does have beneficial impacts for Kansans and the professions, and I appreciate your time, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any questions.
Dave, thank you. And committee, we will hold questions for conferees until after all the proponents have had an opportunity to testify. Next up, we have Becky Fast, Executive Director of NASW, Kansas Chapter. Becky, welcome to the committee. And if you could, please keep your testimony to under 4 minutes. Thank you.
Do less. Hi, I'm Becky Faust. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas Chapter of Social Workers. Social workers are the largest profession of mental health services in Kansas. We feel this is a good bill with the telehealth changes, but there are two components that we would like amended out, that the House Committee amended out. We feel like they add more red tape that impact the ability of social workers to provide mental health to our seniors through hospice, our active military, our children. First is on page 10, and the BSRB did work with the Kansas chapter to lower it to 200 hours, but we ask that this is removed completely. No other state requires this additional red tape, additional hoop. So social work accreditation is 900 hours, and that's what is the licensing boards across the nation. They go with our accreditation board of 900 hours. So Kansas has a whole nother regulatory layer that results in more student loan, makes it harder, takes longer, and more hoops for our MSW students to have to jump through. The second regulatory mandate is on the first page. This is a brand new mandate. We have some concerns about it, that this will make the process harder, take longer, and really impact whether our families receive mental health services. This would require a master level social worker to, when they want to get supervision, they would have to go through this Kansas board approved process, so be a Kansas board supervisor. To become a clinical supervisor, you have gotten your graduate degree, a master's, and then you pass a licensing exam. Then you're under supervision for 2 more years and pass another licensing exam. So our clinical social workers have passed 2 licensing exams, and many of them passed a licensing exam at their bachelor level. Our scores are in the 80% in Kansas, so we have our social workers work hard, that rural work ethic. So we see this as unnecessary because our clinical social workers are competent to supervise. So basically, if you're a social worker in Dodge City, you would go to this board-approved, Kansas board-approved list, and if there is no one there, you might have to then work with a supervisor in Kansas City. So one more obstacle, one more regulatory step, applying an application, a fee, additional training. These supervisory trainings are $300 to $500, very expensive. We are totally for more training, and when we've done surveys, our social workers say, yes, we want more training, but we don't want it to be a mandate. And we are willing to provide training. We've asked BSRB to do lunch and learns, free training, not mandated hoops that people have to go through. So only 17 states have this requirement they are adding, and with BSRB, only 2 of the 7 professions have it. In Western Kansas, we only have 83 clinical social workers. There's a crisis. And why that clinical level is important, because rural Kansas relies on Medicare. I was a hospice social worker. I helped people die along with their priest, their pastor, in comfort. That is funded through Medicare. Rural hospitals rely on Medicare. Nursing homes. Our active military called me and said and begged me at Fort Riley, we need clinical social workers. So we have this huge workforce crisis. We feel like this mandate, even if we lose 4 or 5 people saying, hey, I don't, this is one more step. I'm doing this for free. This is my liability. We lose that service to our active military, to our veterans. So I will just close there. We have a workforce crisis, and we ask that you remove these 2 steps to align with other states. The Department of Justice has put out a grant about an interjurisdictional compact. My national association is looking at applying for it. So I see in front of you in a few years a compact for social work, because the Department of Justice feels like there is such, not Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, sorry about that. They feel like there is such a need for clinical social workers for their active military and their veterans. So thank you.
Becky, thank you very much. Next up, committee, we have Tanya Rickles. She's a social work department chair for Washburn University. Tanya, welcome to the committee, and we just ask that you keep your testimony under 4 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to speak today in support of a bill that is going to create a lot less anxiety for our social work students currently, and social work students that go to Washburn University, like myself, actually. I'm a graduate of that program. We stay in Kansas, care about Kansas, we practice in Kansas. We have an accrediting body, which is the Council on Social Work Education. And as you heard Becky Fass mention, we have standards that are set. We have to have site visits. Actually, Carolyn Zasfron, that's listening right now, was there for our last one, and she knows it's a very, very rigorous process that we have to go through to uphold these standards. And Kansas historically have had higher standards for our social work graduates, and we are meeting those standards. But what research actually shows us is that learning objectives are what actually sets those standards. So we have learning contracts for our students and goals that they have to achieve with their field instructor. So when students actually look at Kansas schools and see that we have this additional mandate, they actually sometimes consider don't come to Kansas schools. And we are facing more and more competition from online programs, which online programs don't necessarily generate Kansas social work students to work here. At a recent event we held just last week, we had Kansas Advocacy Day, where we teach social workers about this process, about how to come see your representatives and to talk to you and share. We had almost 375 people on that Zoom call, and nearly all of them were students. 61% of them say they want to stay here in Kansas, where we have a social work workforce shortage. But this 350 direct service hours creates an additional hurdle. It creates some anxiety, especially in a time of COVID, where students are wanting to get these direct service hours. Sometimes they're not able to achieve those depending on what's going on. The other thing is the telehealth part of the bill will be an amazing part that you guys will support in allowing them to get direct service hours by working with someone one-to-one through phone, video. Those things will be very, very helpful in students practicing, because telehealth medicine is not going away. It is going to stay after the COVID pandemic, and this is a skill that we want our social work students to have. I will close with that. Just to reiterate again, I cannot underestimate how these direct hours are actually part of sometimes the decisions that students do make to choose to come to Kansas schools. And we would love to have these students here practicing in our state. And also the students also wanted to make sure that, again, thank you for considering this bill. Thank you. And I will be happy to answer any social work questions about the bill. Thanks.
Tanya, thank you very much for your testimony. Committee, next we have Kyle Kessler, Executive Director for the Association of Community Mental Health Centers of Kansas. Kyle, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Kyle Kessler with the Association of Community Mental Health Centers. We appreciate the opportunity to appear in support of Senate Bill 238. And we support the bill. We agree with all of the comments that have already been made, so I don't need to take any more of your time other than to say that we also support the amendments that have been suggested by the state chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. Stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Kyle, thank you very much. Committee, next we have Rachel Marsh, CEO for the Children's Alliance of Kansas, and Rachel is joining us via WebEx. Rachel, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Hildebrand and members of the committee. My name is Rachel Marsh, and I'm with the Children's Alliance of Kansas. I just want to briefly highlight how this bill has a unique impact on our child welfare system. Our child welfare providers and members employ licensed social workers, professional counselors, marriage and family therapists, addiction counselors, and psychologists. They work as case managers in-home outpatient and inpatient therapy. And they work as managers and administrators and in coordinating care for behavioral health for children and families. The Children's Alliance supports SB 238 with the similar concerns raised by Director Fast with the KNASW. I wanted to just highlight a unique perspective on the need for workforce shortage to be addressed through this bill that does apply to the child welfare system. Often we are the very first place that people go after they get their bachelor's level of social work, and they may even start there before they get their bachelor's. So we may have the opportunity to recruit someone who goes to college to get a social work degree, someone who gets a master's, and then eventually someone who wants to get a licensed clinical to provide independent therapy as a clinical level social worker. We see regularly that when our providers are unable to provide that clinical supervision, that can cause folks to leave child welfare. And when they leave child welfare to go somewhere else where they might have more chance of getting that clinical social supervision, then we've lost someone who's focused on the children and families who are most vulnerable in Kansas. We support the aspects of SB 238 that make Kansas more competitive in terms of and licensing therapists, and also that make sure that televideo can be used for face-to-face clinical supervision. I did want to just briefly, I don't need to restate it. I think Director Fast did an excellent job of highlighting the concerns about adding another level of board-approved supervision for social workers. What we have seen this last year, particularly during the pandemic, is that our behavioral health providers, well, all of our providers have worked many, many hours, many long hours. We've worked over Zoom, and I'm here by Zoom telling you we're exhausted by Zoom, and we need the support, particularly this year, to continue providing services without additional barriers. I'm concerned that with the approaching burnout that we're having with our mental health professionals across the state, that adding an additional layer of effort to become a behavioral clinical licensed supervisor by January of 2022, we could actually have people who just throw in the towel this year and say, I can't do one more thing. So we would ask you that you would look at an amendment as requested by Director Fast, or particularly look at grandfathering in existing clinical supervisors so we don't create a gap in services, particularly from our perspective, so that we can maintain and continue to grow that child welfare workforce that provides behavioral health services to children and families involved in the child welfare system. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to stand for questions.
Rachel, thank you for your testimony. Committee, next up we have Cynthia Schindle, former president of the Kansas chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. Cynthia, welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Chairman Hildebrand and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As someone who has supervised many social workers for their clinical license, I'm very familiar with the process. At this point, it's already been described by Director Fast that a clinical supervisor at present has already passed a master's level exam and a clinical exam. And in addition, you must practice as an LSCSW for 2 years after getting your own license before you are able to supervise. In general, I believe this is an excellent bill and it will increase the availability of mental health professionals to serve. And we know that we have a mental health crisis in Kansas, as we do across the nation. And so we urgently need more trained LSCSWs to meet this need. Adding the additional barrier of requiring a board supervised clinical supervisor designation, I believe is an unnecessary and it is unnecessary and will cause more people to decide they're not willing to do clinical supervision. It's already a very long process to be able to become a clinical supervisor, and doing the supervision itself takes at least 2 years, requires you to assume liability for your supervisee's practice and to be available around the clock should they need emergency consultation. So these are some of the reasons why it's already difficult for clinical social workers to be willing to undertake this process. I believe that this additional requirement would create another barrier that would reduce the number of LSCSWs who are willing to supervise. So for that reason, I would request that that requirement be amended out. And I'm happy to stand for questions.
Cynthia, thank you for your testimony. Committee, we will now hear from Eric Thomason, Director of Behavioral Health and Addiction Treatment Centers, Community Health Center of Southeast Kansas. Eric, welcome to the committee. And I would just remind the conferees, we are running a little shorter on time. We have about 10 minutes to listen to 4 more conferees, or 3 conferees. So if you can condense your testimony, we would appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Eric, welcome.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric Thomason. I'm the Director of Behavioral Health Services for Community Health Center in Southeast Kansas. Director Fast has already spoken on these topics. A couple things I just wanted to share. Community Health Center had the opportunity to treat over 220,000 visits last year. That accounted for about 62,000 unique individuals. Now, of that amount, 37,000 were behavioral health related visits. 2 key areas in which we use clinical social workers are to deliver school-based behavioral health services and integrated healthcare. We've all talked about the shortage that's within the state of Kansas for providing behavioral health services. The clinical social work role is imperative in providing integrated services to prevent those additional referrals to therapy. Our school-based behavioral health services, oftentimes offered by community mental health centers, they serve to reduce the restriction or the barrier of transportation associated with providing behavioral health services. It allows these children to receive evidence-based practice while in the school. I just want to reaffirm that we support increased availability of mental health providers in the state of Kansas. We also share concerns regarding the board-approved supervisors. Clinical social workers have demonstrated an ability to provide effective care to those in need. And we would also like the committee to consider amending the 350 hours of direct contact as required within the MSW field internship. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll stand for questions should anyone have them.
Eric, thank you very much for your testimony. Committee, that does conclude our oral proponents. I will direct your attention to the written only. We have Linda Bass for KVC Kansas, Andrew Secker, Legislative and Advocacy Chair for the Kansas Counseling Association, Stuart Little, President of Behavioral Health Association of Kansas, Denise Cross, President and CEO of Cornerstone of Care, and then Rennie Schuler McKinney, Clinical Services, Behavioral Health, Advent Health, Shawnee Mission. Committee, do we have questions? Oops. Oh, okay, Kelly. Yeah, you're for neutral, right? Okay, yeah. Sorry. Nope, you're fine. Committee, do we have any questions for proponents? I do have one for Dave. You had mentioned that there were 3 amendments that the House had put on. We heard about 2 of them, I believe, in testimony. What was the third? Just to recap, remove the board-approved clinical supervisor and then remove the 200 in-person training. What was the third amendment?
Correct, Mr. Chairman. And the board-approved clinical supervisor amendment also struck the $50 fee cap. So that was part of that amendment too. The last amendment that the House made amended in some different language from a different bill concerning the Board of Healing Arts that had to do with telemedicine. And I'm not as familiar with that bill. I think it might have been 2206, but I'm not for sure. So some of that language, and it might have been amended language. I'm not sure if it was specifically from the bill as it was initially introduced, but that was the third amendment.
Thank you. Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Becky Fast. In your testimony, you mentioned that this would be an additional barrier for them to have. They currently have 350 hours. Recommendation is reducing it to 200. But if it's part of the additional or part of the total 900, how is that an additional burden?
So every state of the nation says to be a clinical social worker, you have to do the Council of Social Work Education 900 hours.
Right.
So this is above. So Kansas colleges are at 1,200. So we do. So none of our neighbors do that many hours. Every state licensing says you have to do the accreditation standard of 900, but in our regs, we require an additional 350, and they offered to go down to 200.
That seems contrary to Mr. Fry's testimony that I have notes that it was included in, that the 200 hours would be included in. So you're saying.
And I have a practicum director right here that.
Okay.
I have a niche expertise in field education. I'm the professor. Would you like me to answer that question?
Sure, Kelly, but please introduce yourself
Yes,
first.
I'm the director of field education at the KU School of Social Welfare, and I'm a professor of practice there. The requirement for 900 hours of direct client for practicum, I believe what they are talking about when they say the 200 hours are included. What happened with the 350-hour requirement in Kansas is it bumped up our total number of so that we can have students reach that number. We have 720 hours of advanced year clinical hours of practicum, where other states have something closer to 500. So the 200 hours of face-to-face time is in the practicum, but it has this effect of increasing the number of hours so that students can achieve it. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
It's a kind of complicated, convoluted thing.
Senator Holscher.
Thank you. I believe my question is for David. In regard to the training plan that supervisors have to sign off on, how many supervisors are there?
Mr. Chairman, we have looked into this number. I don't have a specific number of supervisors. So currently right now, the BSRB approves supervision plans, but they don't approve specific, there's not a board approved supervisor process. So I have talked to the agency. We approve about 160 to 170 plans per year, but there are different sites for supervision, and supervisors can supervise more than one individual. So that's what I've been able to go through in terms of looking back in our records. And I understand that there's about a 6-year window to obtain some of these supervision hours under those plans. And so that's the information I can provide, but I can't tell you a specific number of supervisors right now in Kansas.
Would you be able to get a breakdown by county by chance as far as what that looks like?
Let me look into that and see if I can get a geographic breakdown.
Committee members, I don't see any further questions for any of the conferees. Is there anyone else that would like to testify as a proponent? Okay, we will now move to our neutral testimony, and we do have one neutral conferee, Kelly Jones, Professor Director of Field Education with KU. Kelly, welcome to the committee.
Thank you for providing this opportunity. I apologize for interrupting earlier. I am not used to this process, so thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all. As I had mentioned, my area of expertise is in field education, but I have 25 years of social work service, and also could tell you a whole lot about dementia if you wanted to ask me about that. We have campuses at KU, both in Garden City. We partner with Pittsburgh State University, and have students also on Edward campus and Lawrence campuses. So I have students across the state. It's my privilege to work with them. And I want to tell you a quick story. About a week ago, I received a call from a student in Southeast Kansas who I adore. She's a quite fine social worker. And she asked me if I would serve as her reference. She's applying for a job in a mental health center in Oklahoma, because she perceives this to be a barrier, the 350-hour direct client contact time or the 200-hour direct client contact time. She's not sure whether she can meet that requirement, and Oklahoma doesn't have that requirement. She's invested 2 years, a lot of time and energy, and intends to have a life of service in mental health and working with individuals who have those needs. And she's going to do it in the path that has the least amount of barriers. So she's going to Oklahoma. And I want to be a good neighbor, but not that good. I'm hoping that she will stay, so I'm working with her. But this would go a long way. Reducing and amending on page 10, line 10, would go a long way for helping me to get her to stay here and to continue to serve our medically underserved areas. So I'm hoping you will consider making that amendment. And I also want to affirm there is nowhere in social work literature around field education that says anything about 250, 350. There's no best practices around this number. I assure you, my students are face-to-face with clients. It just looks different for social workers. Myself, working in the field of dementia, sometimes I spend 5 minutes with a family, sometimes I spend 30 minutes with a family, sometimes I spend an hour trying to find resources for that family. We don't do talk therapy all the time, and so that's why this measure, in terms of trying to have uniformity across clinical social work, clinical psych and social work, is probably not in the best interest of our state workforce enhancement. So I appreciate your time. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for your service.
Kelly, you are the only neutral testimony. So if you would stick around for any questions. I do just have one comment. Thank you very much for trying to keep our Southeast Kansas employees in Kansas.
I really want them there. I'm from a very rural part of the world, and I know how important it is to have mental health workers there. So
that is my home. So
Yeah.
we appreciate you keeping
Yeah.
our constituents here. Senator Petty.
Thank you. And Kelly, you mentioned about the young person that you're trying to keep in Kansas, and good luck with that.
I know.
But do you have an estimate of what for her this 200 or 350 hours would cost?
Actually, that's an interesting question because I can answer it in a couple ways. And one way I would like to answer is it equals extra credit hours for her. Our students have to do extra credit hours of practicum. They pay more to get a social work degree in Kansas than they do in Nebraska, Oklahoma, or Colorado. So there's one cost to it. The additional cost is really around her anxiety and mental health. The amount of times my students tell me, like, well, how many hours do I have? Do I have enough direct client? So they're focusing on quantity, not quality, and it concerns me. And so the cost is not additional other than in credit hours.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kelly, I do not see any more questions from the committee. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Yes. Is there anyone else wanting to testify as a neutral? Okay, not seeing any, we will move on to opponents. The only opponent we have is Randy Kallstrom, President and CEO of the Wyandotte Behavioral Health Network, and he is joining us via WebEx. Randy, welcome to the committee. Randy, I think you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
Okay, my apologies. To be clear, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And my only concern regarding this bill is similar to what Director and others have testified to already regarding the requirement for the supervised BSRB, approved BSRB supervision. I think this would limit the number of supervisors and subsequently the number of LSCSWs in Kansas. Just last night on Facebook, I saw a post asking if anyone in Wichita could provide clinical supervision for a social worker. And to be brief, as a CMHC, we hire a lot of newer and younger LMSWs, largely because our pay scale is small compared to many of our competitors. One of the benefits that we can offer is that clinical supervision. This would be an unnecessary burden to our supervisors to pay additional money, go through additional training. They're all very well qualified. And just in summary, to help make up some time here, I would just urge you to adopt the amendments as has been proposed by others and Director Fast. We need all the LCSWs we can get for all the reasons that have already been testified to. Thank you.
Randy, thank you very much for your testimony. Committee, do we have questions for the opponent? And Senator Petty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Randy, thank you for being here virtually. It's good to see you as always. Currently, do you have, are you able to fill all of your social worker positions?
This is an incredibly competitive time right now. Our salary structure is not market competitive to many of our surrounding areas for a number of reasons. And so it is really that LMSW clinical supervision that we can offer that really becomes an attraction to our workforce. And so to simply answer your question, Senator Petty, the answer is it's a real difficulty attracting staff right now.
Thank you, Randy. And are you a revolving door?
You know, it goes in waves. Over time, yes. We actually have had a recent exodus of clinical social workers and also therapists in general. We've been pretty steady for about a year, but it's a 1 to 2 year lifespan typically.
Randy, thank you for your testimony. I do not see any further questions for you. Are there any others that would like to testify as an opponent? Okay, not seeing any. Committee, this will close our hearing on Senate Bill 238. I would like to draw your attention now to working a couple of bills really quick. But just a note on Senate Bill 238, I would like to work this bill. I know Thursday's probably out of it, but looks like we're probably going to be here Friday. So we're going to plan on working bills Friday. This will be one of them. If you have amendments for Jenna that you would like to be put on this bill, please get with her so she can have those drafted and ready for us on Friday. So now I'm going to draw your attention to Senate Bill 175. Jenna, could you just give us a brief bill explanation, refresher on what Senate Bill 175 is, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, and good morning again. Senate Bill 175 is related to establishing rural emergency hospitals as a separate licensure category of rural hospitals. And as we heard in the testimony, this would enable these hospitals to receive different types of funding. And they would be, these facilities, these rural emergency hospitals would have to be operating 24 hours, but would not have a bed threshold like usual hospitals do. So they wouldn't be keeping patients longer than 24 hours at a time. They would have transfer agreements to do that.
Committee, do we have, what's your pleasure on Senate Bill 175? Senator Petty.
I'll make a motion to pass out Senate Bill 175, favorable for passage.
Okay. Senator Baumgartner.
I'll second that.
Okay, we are going to have a little bit of discussion on this before we pass it out. I do have an amendment that was brought to us, and it is a compromise language with the Kansas Hospital Association, our Medicaid director, and insurance companies. If you go and look at new section 8, I don't know if you guys have the amendment available. Donala can.
Let's see. Mr. Chair, I have it available if you'd like me to
Okay.
share my screen, and I just emailed it to Danola.
Yes, Jenna, please. Thank you. And while she's getting that ready, I'll just give a quick explanation. There was a little bit of concern on the language that it could be implied to mean something that the hospital association didn't want. So they've stricken some of the language, and whenever she gets it up there to where we can read it.
Oh,
Will it show up as an email or will it show up as an email?
Let's see.
So
Are
if
you
you'll
able to see anything from me?
Yeah, yes, Jenna, we do, and we have it, they have it on email as well. Committee, if you'll turn to page 3, new section 8, starting with line 21, it's going to strike everything after the comma, after organization, and line 21, line 22, all of line 22, all of line 23, and then in 24 up to any, and then it is going to insert and all. And I will offer that amendment as a motion. I have a second by Senator Baumgartner. Do we have any discussion on this amendment? Okay. Senator Stephan. Senator Gossage.
I just have a quick comment. I think that this is a good compromise that they've put together here, and I know a lot of people have worked on it, and I will be voting in favor of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, could you share again who worked on this?
This was a compromise between the Kansas Hospital Association, some commercial insurance companies, and the Medicaid director. Was there anybody else in that? Touched it. Okay, thank you. Senator Stephan.
Thanks, Chairman. Jenna, could you kind of decipher it and what do we think this amendment exactly means, please?
I can attempt to do that, Mr. Chair. This would.
Jenna,
Yeah.
if you don't feel comfortable, I think I could probably explain it if that's okay.
Okay, yes, that would be fine. It's sort of a niche thing, so
Sure.
that'd be great.
Committee and Senator Stephan, there was some concern that the way this was written, that it would mean that Medicaid and insurance companies would have to pay someone even if there was not a contract for that service. And that isn't what was implied, or that wasn't the intent of the bill. So what that does is it strikes that out, the language in there that could be construed that way, and then just put in that as long as there is so what that will mean is as long as there's a contract with that hospital, then it would be paid out like a regular payment for benefit. The thing that for the hospitals, the concern with the hospitals, if they go from a designation of a critical access hospital to rural emergency hospital, is they want to make sure that by doing that, they're not going to lose the ability to have those contracts with the hospital or with the insurance companies and still be able to offer Medicaid and Medicare. So that's why this is important to have that part in there. This just clarifies the language that it's not a mandatory, that no matter what, you have to pay, an insurance company or Medicaid has to pay regardless of a contract.
Mr. Chairman, if this second agrees, I'll amend my motion. The motion's on the floor.
Looks like she's agreeable. Senator Petty?
Okay, I will make a motion to pass that Senate Bill 175 as amended, favorable for passage.
And I do apologize, we have not voted on the
That's okay.
amendment
Put
yet.
on-
So,
yeah. Okay.
are there any further questions on the amendment? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Motion carries. Senator Petty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a good procedural move. I will make a motion to offer, to pass out Senate Bill 175 as amended, favorable for passage.
And the second agrees. Are there any further discussions on this motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senate Bill 175 being passed out as amended, say aye. All those opposed, no. That motion is carried. Senate Bill 175 will be going to the floor as amended. Real quick, one last one. I would like to work Senate Bill 170. I do not believe there were any amendments or going to be any amendments So correct me if I am wrong, but committee, what's your desires for Senate Bill 170? Senator Holscher.
Move we pass out SB 170 favorable for passage.
We have a motion by Senator Holscher to pass out Senate Bill 170 favorably. A second by Senator O'Shea. Is there any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. So Senate Bill 170 will be going out. And Senator Gossage has agreed to carry this bill on the floor. And committee, that concludes our work for today. We still, just to refresher, we still have a couple of bills that we are going to work that we haven't yet. So if you do have any amendments, please get those to Jenna. We are going to either work these tomorrow or Friday. Senate Bill 138, Senate Bill 238, and if time allows, Senate Bill 12. Thank you very much, and this meeting is adjourned.